Mary Clark Moschella serves as a professor of pastoral theology at Yale Divinity School. But as has been sort of my ritual in introductions, Mary Clark Moschella is the reason why I got into theological ethnography at all. Before she was at Yale, she served as a professor at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., where I did my Master of Divinity. And so in my very first year, I noticed on the course listings, there was this full year course called Ethnography and Pastoral Practice, Part 1 and Part 2. And I said, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't even know this would be an option at the seminary, but it was there. And it also happened to be the first year that she published her now very well-regarded book on ethnography as pastoral practice that has become an amazing tool for a lot of people entering this field. I'm happy to announce that Dr. Moschella's text is so well regarded that it's now in a second edition. The second edition has just been published, I believe, in collaboration with SCM Press. And so today, in addition to talking to her a little bit about how her mind has changed over her career of this kind of work, we're also going to highlight a little bit about the book and how her perspectives have changed between editions. It certainly laid a foundation for me, and I'm just so thankful that it will continue to lay a foundation for many scholars that are oriented toward the church and the world in the way we are. So Mary, it's great to see you.
Thank you, Easton. I'm so happy to see you, and thank you for your kind introduction. And it's great to be part of this wonderful conference. And especially it's an honor to be interviewed by you, Dr. Law, and to see how you have established yourself as an academic and as a rising star in this field. It means so much to me.
Oh, again, thank you for, for setting the foundation for me. And so this conversation is very meaningful for me as well, as a student to a teacher, but again, and in some ways new for me as a colleague in this work together. So with that in mind, I'd like to start our conversation with this question about how did you initially discover the intersection between pastoral theology and qualitative research? And why did you choose to invest in this approach compared to perhaps the other paradigms for pastoral theology that were offered up during your early studies and early ministry?
Well, to be honest, I kind of stumbled into it. I had been a pastor in the UCC for 13 years before I decided to go back to school to study pastoral theology. And I went to Claremont, and Claremont at that time had a requirement that I thought it was a hazing ritual called breadth exams. These were exams you had to take before you started classes, and not just in languages, but in systematics and history of religion and ethics and pastoral theology. And, I'd been out of school for some years. I had young children, and I didn't know how I was going to do this, but they handed us these study sheets of some book lists to prepare for these exams. And on the history of religion's book list were two books that really ended up changing the whole direction of my studies. One was Robert Orsi's The Madonna of 115th Street, and the other one was Karen McCarthy Brown's Mama Lola, a Haitian voodoo priestess in Brooklyn. And we probably read that in the class you took. When I read Orsi's book about Italian immigrants' devotional practices in New York during the 20th century, I had this eerie feeling that he knew me, and it wasn't entirely a comfortable feeling. But the culture he was describing was familiar to me. It reminded me of my grandparents and who were Italian immigrants, and their devotional practices that had interested me, mesmerized me as a child, of burning candles in front of statues of the saints, things like that. And so I thought, Orsi knows me and I've never met him. And he knows something about me that even my therapist doesn't know, right? So as I began my studies in pastoral theology, which at that time was very much based around the intersection between psychology and theology, I felt like I needed to add something, to my program. And they wanted us to have a cognate field anyway there. So I chose American social history with an emphasis on immigration studies. And I think that's where it started. And that's where I learned about things like the invention of ethnicity and the history of race in the US. So that was very important to me. It's like the social cultural dimension of faith. And then with my dissertation, I decided that, like Orsi and Karen McCarthy Brown, I wanted to research lived religion. And I took some courses, to get me started in qualitative methods. And I chose to study like the devotional practices of Italian immigrants in San Pedro, California, at Mary Star of the Sea Church, which was really fun. I always say, if you can do your dissertation on the beach, go for it. So I guess that was the beginning. And in one of the courses I audited on interpreting religious experience, it was taught by Ann Taves, by the way, a historian. There were both doctoral students and D-Mins in the class. And we talked a lot about our research in the class. Everyone was doing a project as we were learning the tools. And there was one D-Min in there who had done was studying two congregations, one where he was the pastor and one where he was not. And as he started talking about his research, I was just struck by what an impact the process of doing the research was having on him and on his congregation. And like his experiences of interviewing really ended up changing him and his relationships with the people in his church. He said, before we were just playing church, and now we're being honest, like we're being real, as we gather together. And our, spirituality is not something we're pretending to do. We're entering into it. And so I think I always remembered that. And that's what eventually, got me interested in thinking about ethnography as a pastoral practice. So that's too long of an answer.
It was a wonderful answer. I think a lot of us in the room can relate to some of these motifs in your story. I certainly do. There was something about the lived religion of the congregations that we either were a part of or that we saw from afar that wasn't reflected in the theological curriculum. What strikes me about your answer was there was, you were assigned work by sociologists and anthropologists that captured imagination, but they don't do the theological reflection. They don't necessarily think about the pastoral practice, and it makes me, and I do wonder for many of us here whether there was that gap that we were seeking to fill. And in large part, thanks to you, that gap is filled more than it once was, and many other scholars that we've had, like Pete Ward and John Swidden. And so as we continue to sort of reflect on your journey, once you've completed your studies, I'm curious about how you sort of developed your particular perspective and method toward ethnography as a pastoral practice. And you've talked a little bit about the books that were influential, but can you share a little bit about the projects you did, in terms of the research that you did following your dissertation work that might have sharpened or shaped the way that you approached this method?
Well, I think the dissertation was really the one big ethnography that I myself conducted. But when I got my first teaching job at Wesley, I started to kind of cobble together a course that utilized ethnography and congregational studies and pastoral theology. I mean, the idea was, I think, for my field, I wanted to find a way to offer pastoral care that extended to groups of people, not just individuals. And I mean, it's the communal contextual model. So the whole field was moving in this direction, but I felt like we were lacking like paths to doing that work. Like, how do you care for your congregation as a whole? And so I was asked to teach a course to Dean Mins, and I thought, well, here they are, you know, these students who are coming back, who are established professionals in the field, but they're coming back wanting something more, wanting to learn something more. So I sort of practiced on them. They were not all very happy to have to do the kind of work I was asking them to do, but I ended up putting things together, you know, and Elaine Graham's book, Transforming Practice, an older book of hers, was especially helpful. So the idea was, you know, how can we learn from the people we minister to and with, and how can we learn to listen, you know, in a different way, so that we hear not just personal stories, and as you know, pastoral theology always taught us to do, but also group stories, you know, cultural stories, and, you know, the history of groups, you know, whether it be a congregation or some other kind of ministry, the history of an agency, you know, that was working for social change. So I think this is how it sort of started to come together.
Yeah, and for those of us that are teaching, it's so true that the classroom is often where the ideas get cobbled together and they get
Yes,
refined over time. I'm experiencing some of that right now, as a new teacher, and but what hearing this story makes me think that in many ways that cobbling together was an intervention for a gap you saw in pastoral theology at that time.
absolutely. I mean, I wanted to make a contribution. I just definitely, you know, wanted to do that so badly. And you know, I talked to a publisher at Pilgrim, which is actually still my publisher, Timothy Stavtag. I don't know if anyone remembers him, but he's still around. He's at Baker, I think. And I wanted to get him to publish my dissertation, and he didn't really want to do that. But he said, "Tell me what your next book is going to be." So I started yakking about this, and he said, "Oh, that's the one I want to publish." And so I took him at his word, you know, and he did, you know, come through. But students were asking for a roadmap, because you know, I had one book in pastoral theology, one book in practical theology, one book from congregational studies, one book from history of religion. And, you know, this was the course. And they're like, you know, give us a roadmap. Sharon Ringy, distinguished New Testament scholar, I don't know if you remember her, she had written a roadmap to studying the New Testament. So they said, we need something like that. So it really did come from, you know, students saying this is what they needed.
Yeah, and obviously, your training made you like a good, not just a listening pastor, but a listening teacher. It seems, as you put their feedback into this book. I do remember using the book, and I think it did what you set out for, because we also read practical theology here, pastoral theology here, congregational studies here, and there was a lot of different perspectives being thrown around. But your text did provide at least a pathway for these different things to connect. And I can imagine feeling more fragmented if that book wasn't there.
Mm.
So thank you for writing this book, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how your mind has changed over your years of teaching uh, pastoral theology. I guess I'll highlight one thing that I heard from you earlier. by means of transition is, it seems like pastoral theology was very individually focused for some time, right?
Mhm.
And even if we were studying family systems and care, it was always about the individual and how they connected to these things. And I think your intervention helped us to think about pastoral care as a collective, taking into part collective histories and things like that. And so you sort of your work has sort of set that table. Um, how has your mind changed regarding the evolution of pastoral theology and how people should be approaching it?
Hmm. Well, I think, I mean, I still, there's some ways in it that it hasn't changed. I see the interconnection between the personal and the political, as feminist theologians taught us. Um, I see the importance of going back and forth between, hearing personal stories and um, hearing collective stories. And, one of the strands that is in both editions of the book, there's a little bit about narrative spiritual care, which is something I'm working on now. And I think that's another kind of like approach um, to listening to stories and drawing the connections really between personal stories, group stories, and cultural stories. Some hegemonic discourses that have a lot of power and influence over individuals and communities, the stories they tell and the lives they lead. So I'm kind of pushing in a little different direction there now. But I think in terms of like, the shift between 2008 and now, with the second edition of the book coming out, I think, there was a lot of updating that needed to be done. I talked a lot about tape recorders in the first edition. Most people don't use tape recorders anymore. And there are big changes in the way people do qualitative research. A lot more online research, of course, is now being used. But I think, I mean, the bigger change is that, when I first started doing it, I was like making it up as I went along. But now I realize everyone else has been doing this kind of work too, in slightly different ways. And it's really exciting to see how ethnography and theology has blossomed, right? And like how in many different fields within the theological disciplines. So like Todd Whitmore's work as a Catholic ethicist, for example, was so exciting. And I really, how ethicists in general have taken up the study of anthropology and using ethnographic methods. Just what I see now that I didn't see then is how broad the possibilities are using this method to really make an impact in lived religion and just human social arrangements. And there's an amazing young scholar named Ryan Juskus who's there, I believe, at Princeton now. He was at Duke, and I asked him to write an essay for me that's like in the appendix of the second edition. So his work engages the environmental crisis, okay, and interviews people in faith-based, like citizen scientists who have been working to document the impact of resource extraction on people who live in the communities where this work is done and how it's changed their quality of life. so, I mean, I just see how, you know, how broad the applications are for these research methods and methodologies. And I find it so exciting. So, I mean, I think that's how my mind has changed. And, you know, even the people you have there at the conference, the distinguished scholars and students who all have, you know, ideas about ways to use these methods. And also recognizing how, you know, BIPOC scholars are using these methods and starting their own groups. I just find very exciting, you know, and enlightening.
It is a very exciting time. I've been energized over the course of this weekend hearing about the different projects of the people in this room, and even more so the collaborative spirit of that. There's really been a willingness to be honest about the questions we're asking, and there's been energy in the way that those questions have been asked of fields from sort of politics to you know, justice and pastoral care, care for pastors. I'm thinking just about a wide range, Christian ethics. There is a huge applicability, and I think the way that the current generation is working with this is encouraging, because it's I get the sense that we all want to be more collaborative,
Mhm.
and we want to learn how to be collaborative, because the academy isn't always the most collaborative space. Um, and so
Well,
I'm really
yeah.
pleased. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's so important. And you know, I tried to kind of nurture that in my classrooms, really in all of them, but especially in the research methods course, because um, we can uh, we can get into trouble if we are isolated in this work. It's easy to be isolated. You're out there in the field, wherever that may be, whether it's, you know, on a website or you know, in a distant land, or whether it's, you know, your local church. You can be kind of isolated in this work, and we need each other, I think, to be sounding boards and to hear the dilemmas that we're experiencing, but also to challenge us, you know, on issues of ethical accountability, reflexivity. We need to have a community of scholars that we trust, where we can be so open. That's one of the things I love about the Ecclesiology and Ethnography network. It's been so precious to me. There's really a great spirit of openness. And I mean, I think the work itself kind of encourages that, because it's based on curiosity and nobody has the answers, right? We're looking for new answers, and it's always full of surprise. But we can get out too far on a limb, or we can get stuck. And if we try to kind of smudge over the problems in the work, you know, we don't really get the kind of clarity we're after, right? And that the power to make a difference in the field that we're studying.
Absolutely. And then one of something you shared that I want to transition to is another theme that has been explored in many of our workshop sessions, and this is the presence of our interlocutors, participants, allies, informants, call them what you will, and what it means to do this kind of project in a way that is accountable to them. And I know the way that you taught me, and I imagine you continue, is, you know, as from the perspective of pastoral care, there very much is an accountability to the congregation that you're studying, or the groups that you're working with. And I was wondering, if you could give a little bit of your take and your perspective on what it means to do this type of work, not just for research, sake, but really for the congregation or the community. That was something that you really emphasized, and I'm curious about how you continue to teach on this question.
Yes. Well, I continue to emphasize the IRB, and at Wesley we were just trying to create an IRB committee, but at Yale we have one, and it's a lot of trouble, and it's every year they change it, and the program that you have to put your work through is difficult and frustrating at times, but I insist that my students take their projects through that process, even if the IRB committee is going to say in the end that it's exempt. That's a judgment someone else makes. You don't make that judgment, because the laws are there to protect people, to protect people's privacy. And especially if you have privilege, if you say you go to visit a group and you say, I'm a researcher from Yale, you have privilege, and you just don't, you can't take any shortcuts in terms of informed consent and, accountability to the people that are opening up their lives to you. So that's one thing I've gotten probably more clear about, more insistent, and it is a learning process. And I know, because I did one recently, that it takes a lot of time, but it's worth it. I mean, the other thing is just thinking about the question, who am I doing this research for? And if it's not, at least to some extent, for the sake of the people themselves, then I don't think you ought to do it. If, of course, when you're taking a course, you want to pass the course, and if you're writing a dissertation, you want to graduate. So we're doing the work for ourselves, and we have to be honest about that. But we need to think through, what is the impact of this work? Who is it going to help? Who might it hurt? Whom might it hurt? I guess is good. But how can we, choose topics and work that are going to be beneficial to other people and to the world we live in, So I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you for that perspective. And while we're on the topic of the next generation of scholars, I'm wondering, just what are your hopes for the future of this intersection between practical and pastoral theology and ethnography and qualitative research? What advice do you have for people that are maybe at the dissertation stage, thinking about what kind of project to do, how to work that project out? That's just something that we're all always kind of pondering, even as even after your PhD, you're thinking about what's the next project.
What's
right?
the next thing? Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thoughts and any advice on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's important to have a wide lens, especially when you first go into wanting to do a project, and think about what's the best way to do it. When I wrote a book on joy in 2016, and I thought, well, should I do a qualitative study and interview people? And I thought, well, if I interview people, I might be leading the witness. If I say, when do you feel joy? Then people might think they're obligated to say that they feel joy. They might not ever feel joy. So I tried to do qualitative research in a different way by looking at first person, published accounts that were already out there, and sort of catching it in action. So I think there are many different ways to try to learn, but it's important to think about your values, your calling, your sense of the holy, and where that's leading you. And then, start small, take a little piece of your question, not necessarily the biggest question first, take a little piece of it. And, if it involves a place, or, go there and just try to hang out for a while, a walk around, see what grabs you, what feels important. I think you need to find something that you're excited about, and something where you think your research could help, perhaps to answer a question, to fill in a gap, maybe to move the dial in a certain direction. And then, treat the people who share their lives with you with respect. And, try to be open. A lot of people start the research with a careful plan, and I think the plan is very important. But then they get there and they find out that the issues that the people have in that space are really different from the ones, that they designed. The questions are different. So don't be afraid to throw away your questions and listen to the people. Just trust that, your questions are there. They got you there. They got you through the IRB perhaps. And if you have to change them, if listening to the people leads you in a different direction, I would say, don't be afraid, I think of it as a journey, and keep writing and reflecting, journaling, and talking to colleagues, talk things over with the community, and, see where you land. And I think if you're in a program and you want to finish within a certain number of years, whatever, don't try to do everything at once. You may learn about other research questions that you have, that you have to write them down and put them to the side if you're going to follow one or two of them out, fully. But yeah, I would say, go for what grabs you, but also listen to the people. And, if you are surprised or troubled, pay attention, because that's where the learning might be. That might be your point of big discovery,
Yeah. I think
yeah, go ahead.
when I was hearing you share about that, it dawned on me how important it is to listen for the questions of the community that you're with, that the questions that they're asking.
Mhm.
We always start with our questions, and I do think there is something in this that answers the previous question of how do we be accountable to our communities, and that is that
Yes.
to listen to the questions that they're asking, and perhaps our research helps them answer that question even for themselves.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then there's a certain immediate payoff's not the right word. There's a certain gift that they might receive from you if you can listen carefully. You might hear a question that they're asking that they're not even able to articulate. And so there's so much listening. There's a more collective process to the research question than when we might even initially think of. The academy trains us to think that we should have our research question and then go in, but to really have an openness to the co-creation of that research question, I think is really something that's dawned on me as I've listened to you. share a little bit?
Absolutely. I think that's respectful, and it gives people, you become truly co-researchers, and they're not just, subjects of your research, but you become, co-learners. And that's where a lot of the excitement is, I think, and the kind of opportunity for, what I might call like spiritual growth.
Mhm.
My pastoral theology side is strong, and there's this learning that comes, you know, in the moment of, realization, when you ask a question and people answer it and they hear themselves answer it.
Mhm.
There's like the gift, of that moment that is shared, and the recognition um, that people have, or the resonance they feel with others in the community, and their sense of where, say, God might be guiding them to move next. It's like it's right there in the moment, right in front of you, and it is, it's holy.
Yeah, we've. I feel like there's a project here that we could, as a network, reflect on. Is we have all these different labels for how we can, what we can call our participants slash informants slash co-researchers, but each of those is an angle to the relationship. And
Yes.
I like what you just said. We haven't talked about it so much, but co-learners. That as much as we're learning, they're learning, and what does it mean to make them a part of that learning? And to reflect back uh that
It's an energizing process, I mean, that's why I like teaching it. It's never boring. There's always something new in even if some of this projects sound similar, there's always something new. And that moment of learning, I think, um, it's worth pondering in it, and it's fun. I think I mentioned in the second edition that one of my students at Yale did a study with children, and of course it took a lot to get through the IRB if you're going to interview children. But she decided, in terms of respect, that she would offer them the opportunity to select their own pseudonym, and they all chose like superheroes. Okay, so so her ethnography says, well, Batman said that, uh, you know and there's like this wonderful sense of connection and energy that came out. And the children, first of all, here they are, being taken seriously, as Dave Sinos would call them, little theologians, right? They're being taken seriously. Their meaning making is being valued, and and the process is making them feel strong.
and some of the conversations we've had during the conference, this nagging question of what is theological about this work, that's always present. But I think listening to you and reflecting on what you've been saying, that co-creation, if we can orient our projects with an eye toward, like, they're helping me create something, and maybe I'm helping them answer a question that is burning within them, that we're co-creating something. And that genesis, I think, is a rich space for um the presence of God. That it's not just you and me co-creating something, researcher and researched, or whatever terms we want to use, but then that God is somehow overseeing this relationship as well. And that's, once we keep that in mind, it becomes, I think, a very, very robust and perhaps holy space, this type of work. I'm mindful of time. I want to give space to our audience to ask some questions. So I'll just ask one last question, and then I'll turn it over. And that is, what questions do you have right now that you're sort of working with, that you want to pursue? We're always asking questions. And so what are your current questions?
Well, the biggest project I'm working on right now is on narrative spiritual care. And even though, like I sort of mentioned it in this book, and I relied a little bit on Ed Wimberly's work on that, I've kind of taken that to a new level. And again, through teaching it, through my students, kind of realized that we need a kind of a roadmap for that as well. So the way it's related to qualitative research is that it's a different way of asking questions and having a conversation, and it can in fact be used in a study, I think. But it's asking questions that invite people to deconstruct some of the harmful narratives that we live with, and to identify their own values and aspirations, what we would call their preferred stories, and figure out how to live out of those. So that's my project at the moment.
I think that has resonance with a number of people in the room. We've talked about narrative as that important structuring piece for so many things. So again, thank you for sharing a little bit about your journey and what you've been working on. It's really a pleasure. I want to open up our time to questions from the audience about your work or anything else related to perhaps questions that we're all asking.
Hi, Mary. It's Eileen.
Hi, Eileen.
Good to see you.
You too.
Walk a little closer so you can see me.
Yes, so I can see you.
I wondered if you would just talk to this group about how you think about the writing life in relationship to these projects you've done and how you have cultivated your sense as a writer.
Okay. Well, there's a poet, Jane Kenyon, whose work I love. She's deceased, but she said, read a lot, have good sentences in your ears. And the older I get, the more I realize that it's important to me to read all kinds of literature. I do read poetry every morning now, and then I write. And I also read novels and memoirs and ethnographies and histories. And to me, it's important to just kind of open all the channels of understanding. But I also think in terms of writing and writing ethnography, it's great to read some things that have a little lyricism to them, so that you can kind of learn how to pick up on images and metaphors that help, kind of get the gist of your learning across in your ethnography. So David, I'm blanking on his name, sorry. A friend of mine has written a book about how you get through seminary. And he said, when people say to him, do you think I could be a pastor? His answer to them is, well, I don't know. Do you like, and what do you think his question might be? Do you like what? Do you like God? Right? Do you like conflict? Right? No, his question is, do you like metaphor? And he asked that question because, in the theological life, we're always using metaphors, right? We can't describe God precisely, and we just can't. You know, all of our words are metaphors. All of our carefully worded theologies are not God. They're just words about God. And so I think reading widely, reading around, just kind of enriches our capacity to describe what we learn, you know, in engaging ways. It's also important, you know, to find out what others have learned about your topic. And so you might find, you know, similar studies and be able to draw connections to those studies as well.
Wonderful. Any other questions from those in the room, as well as if anyone online has a question, you can feel free to raise your hand. We are keeping an eye on that.
I'm coming out from the right side of the screen, Katie Douglas. I'm going to be doing a study with families, and you talked about learning not just from individuals, but also communities. I'm going to be studying families and thinking about how they navigate marginalized identities as they form faith in their kids. So everybody encounters folks with marginalized identities, and I'm wondering theologically, what are the resources that they're using? How do they interpret different passages of scripture? And one of my big conundrums that's still unresolved is how should I include kids in that, empower their voices? When parents are with their kids, they'll talk about their kids differently than if their kids are not there. And when you talk about kind of listening to stories of communities, if I think about the family as this little community, do you have any wisdom on that? Listening pastorally to stories that might be really vulnerable, or I assume actually are pretty vulnerable, where there's a lot at stake, but with a wide range of family members potentially present or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the question. And while it would be very interesting to meet with a family as a group, I don't know, have you thought about having like smaller groups where, say, there are a number of children together, and then maybe some groups of parents to, you know, hear their stories, because you will hear different things and you'll learn different things. And I think particularly with children, the idea of having some of them together is a little bit protective for them in their vulnerability. But there's also, I think, more freedom for them to talk in ways that kids talk. And I, again, thinking of Dave Sinos, he had children draw pictures, and then he asked them questions about their pictures. So that's another way of sharing the questions, because the research questions came from the pictures the children had drawn, instead of him bringing his questions to them. So yeah, I think it might be worth experimenting a little bit, and you could do both, you know, particularly if parents are nervous about you interviewing their children apart from them. Of course, you need everybody's permission.
That's helpful.
Good. You all must be tired. I know you've gone to so many great lectures, and, you know, heard about so many different research projects this weekend.
I just want to cycle back. I'm still dwelling on this, and, you know, I guess host privilege, I'm just going to keep talking about it. The idea that the questions of the community, the questions of the children, and how fantastic that, you know, your friend to draw those questions out through their pictures. And I wonder, as a community, how are we drawing the questions that the community that we're working with, you know, letting that shape our questions as well. I just was coming back to that thought. But any other questions or thoughts here?
You know, sometimes you can, I think, find the questions just by going, to the place. Like, I've sometimes heard pastors say, well, this church isn't very faithful because all they care about is the Christmas bazaar, and they don't care about theology. So I say, well, have you ever gone to a Christmas bazaar? Have you hung out in the kitchen and listened to what people are talking about there? And have you asked people, what it means to them, why they do this Christmas bazaar? And so I think sometimes if you want to get closer, to people's own questions, it's just a little bit of a matter of, hanging out and spending time. And Todd Whitmore talks about this also, how, he had to learn in refugee communities that he went to walk softly, to go through the community, and instead of asking people to answer questions that they were terrified to answer for political reasons, he learned to let them get to know him a little bit, and then gradually, answer their questions, and then, gradually, develop trust. And, that's how he found out what their questions were.
Yeah, there's definitely, I mean, I guess in some of the methodology literature, it would be, building rapport with your participants, right? But I think as theologians, it's more than just building rapport.
Okay.
And that's something to keep in mind as we think about our projects. How much time have we spent in relationship and letting these communities ask questions of us? I think if we haven't done that in some way, shape, or form, it's something we might want to go back to. And because there's been also questions in this community, I mean, in our gathering about where do I fit in the story? And struggling with how do I fit? I think it might be interesting to, well, why don't we let the community think about where I fit in their story?
Yes.
And having them give feedback on our own autoethnographic questions sometimes is something that just dawned on me, because I know that is a question that a number of us are also asking in this room. Yeah, and something to consider.
Yeah, and I think at first, like I was kind of hesitant when I did my my research in San Pedro, like how much do I say about myself, and I was more like, well, do I have to keep a sort of distance? And there was a woman who was like a gatekeeper there, and she said, you need to tell me why you're doing this. And I said, well, I'm in school, blah, blah, blah. And she said, no, why are you here? And I looked at her and I said, because I miss my grandmother. And she said, good girl. And then she opened the door. She made introductions for me. She trusted me, And I think if we're not willing to like give a little bit of ourselves, then we don't really have any business asking other people to, open their hearts to us.
Those are very wise words indeed. The vulnerability of the researcher to the community is a tricky one, and I think one we have to take seriously as well.
Yeah. And then I think the questions are too, like, what do you owe? How do you repay people? When the research relationship is over. The old school used to be you disappear and you never come back. But is that appropriate? Is that fair and just and good? Or do we do we incur obligations, as we do to friends and others in our lives that kind of last, that go beyond the research project?
Yes, indeed. Well, again, I want to thank you so much, Mary, for taking time out of your Sunday morning to join us for this conversation and for
You're so welcome. It's really been my joy.
for closing our time with these questions about listening, about what our relationships to communities, and things that will continue to I think we'll all continue to linger with. So if we can give a warm round of applause to.
Thank you, and thank you to you all.